asking you to tell us your name and where you were born and when.
My name is Joseph Mury. I was born here in West Ayrshire in what they call Mury-July, and I was born on December 7th, 1925.
What I'd like to do is get a little bit of the history of your family first. Could you tell us about your parents and your grandparents?
My father died when I was 3 months old. He was 47. I was brought up by my mother. She lived to be 90. We were 8 children in the family. I was the youngest. I remember my grandmother on my mother's side and my grandfather on my father's side. The others were dead when I was born.
What were their names, your mother and father?
My father was Joseph Mury II, and my mother was Almada Babin.
And what was your father doing?
Jason, 1 second.
So what was your father doing?
My father used to work in the States. He'd leave about March and work all summer in the States and come back home in the fall. He worked at carpentry. He was a construction carpenter, and for a time he was also a cabinet maker, not for too long.
And your grandparents, your grandfather?
My grandfather on my father's side, they did mostly farming. He was mostly a farmer. His name was Remy Mury. And he lived in the house that's presently being occupied by Antoine Mury and his family. My grandfather on my mother's side was Benjamin Babin. He was a mariner, famous sailor, I guess. He went on the vessels and worked as a sailor. My grandmother on my mother's side, her name was Sophie. She was born Sophie Goyesh, came from Cape Hogan. She was also a midwife. My grandmother on my father's side, I never knew, but I understand she was just a housewife, and though they did a lot of farming at that time, so she probably did a lot of gardening and so forth.
So the Murys were primarily farmers?
Primarily farmers, as I know, yeah.
Do you know, is that an Acadian name?
As far as I know, the Murys, I thought came from France, but later I heard, and I think I can confirm that they came from Switzerland. They spoke French, but were not necessarily from France. They were at the border of Switzerland and France. And they, as far as I know, they migrated to Little Brador in the Bullardry area of Cape Breton. And from there, they migrated to West Ayrshire here, married here, settled, and then their family. There are very few Murys, as I know, with this particular spelling. But the fact that I believe we came from Switzerland is that I saw an Albert Mury on TV one time, and he was one of these people involved in laundering dirty money, and he was from Switzerland. I saw him twice on TV, and the name was spelled identical to ours, M-U-R-Y.
So when did they come? Do you know when they arrived?
I wouldn't have anything certain on when they arrived here, but it would have been in about the mid-18s. But the Babins and the Mirans on my grandmother's, on my father's mother's side, that dates way back from the 1600s.
What was your father's mother, you said? What was her name?
My mother's name was Almada Babin. She was a Babin.
With your father's mother, you said? What was
My
it?
father's mother was Mirand. M-I-R-A-N-D.
So the Mury, were they fishing as well?
I suppose they probably did some fishing, but primarily they were farmers.
What kind of a farm did they have? How big was it?
It was, by this area's standards, it was probably one of the larger farms around West Ayrshire, but it wasn't necessarily a large farm by farmer standards. And I think they were hard-working people, and they did a lot of farming for others, such as ploughing fields with oxen and hauling wood and doing that type of work for others as well as their own. They kept cattle.
So how many, was your family doing any farming when you were growing up?
It was more or less a necessity to do some farming, some type of farming, not on a large scale, but enough to maintain the family. My mother always had a garden. There was always potatoes planted every spring. That was a must, because that's all you wouldn't have been able to eat. You couldn't buy potatoes. My mother was a widow and there was very little income.
So there wasn't, you guys weren't necessarily involved in large scale farming?
Not large scale, no. We had a cow and a pig, chickens, and usually the spring calf became the winter's meat. And the cow, of course, supplied the milk and the butter, things like that. The garden supplied the vegetables. The woodlot supplied the fuel for the winter.
So in other words, you were pretty much self-sufficient?
Well, you had to be. It was a matter of there wasn't that much income coming in. I was born just before the 30s, so it wasn't a very prosperous period when I was coming up.
So what was that like? Did the Depression, things weren't all that good here before the Depression. Did the Depression make things worse?
Yes, it made money harder to come by, and some people suffered. I can't say that I ever went without a meal. We always had something to eat, but there were no frills.
Were there some people who didn't have enough to eat?
Oh, I'd say there were, yes.
Here in West Ayrshire?
I would think so, yes.
I want to talk a little bit about the self-sufficiency. The gardens, for example. When would you have planted your garden?
To start, I guess, in April. I remember I wasn't very old there, and you used to use a wheelbarrow to haul manure to the garden and till the soil over with a fork and prepare the garden for the summer planting. And then that had to be maintained. It had to be weeded and kept and watered and so forth.
April sounds earlier than most people plant now.
Well, that's when you'd start, but you wouldn't necessarily sow at that time. You'd probably start sowing in May or something like that. But it seemed that springs came along earlier then. I don't suppose the weather was a lot better, but I guess you started earlier maybe.
Spring started earlier. So you were planting. How big would the garden have been?
Well, various people in various sizes, families, I suppose, had various size gardens, but ours was probably about 75 by 125 feet.
And how did you preserve your vegetables over the winter?
Most of the vegetables were stored in the cellar. Potatoes, the cabbages, the turnips, carrots, onions, I remember. And the meat, like after the pig was butchered in the fall, that was salted in a barrel in the cellar. Things like milk was you had fresh milk every day, so you didn't worry too much about storing milk for any length of time, but there was no refrigeration. There was no electricity when I was coming up either. I wired the house, so it wasn't there when I was coming up.
terms of keeping the animals, you only said you only had a few animals. Whose job was it to take care of the animals?
Uh, Most of the time it was the children, the older ones would start, and then as they drift off, the others, the younger ones would take over. It was a matter of feeding, cleaning the barn, milking the cow, taking the milk in, separating the milk to get the cream from the milk. Gave the separated milk to the calf, the drink, and the cream of course became butter, and that's how we lived.
Was there much work taking care of the animals?
Not too much, it was mostly routine. It was probably done twice a day, like in the morning there was a matter of going, cleaning the barn, feeding the animals, milking the cow, and then that was good until afternoon you'd feed them again and milk again, and that was okay until the next morning.
Was there much expense involved? You hear people now have animals, sometimes it's expensive to maintain them.
Not at that time, no. Things were pretty general. There wasn't too much. You'd make hay in the summertime, so that would feed the animals, and you'd buy the odd bag of feed to make the meals for them a little richer.
Were you making hay by hand?
Making all by hand, yeah.
So you cut it with the
Mowed
saw?
by side. Tended the hay with forks, and if there was danger of rain or something like that and you wanted to put the hay in a hurry, well, you'd sometime hire a neighbor with a horse, but usually it was done by hand, most times hauled by hand with 2 poles slid under the haystack, and you'd haul that to the barn and put it upstairs.
So, what about the wood now?
The wood, usually the winter was the time that the wood was taken care of. Like in our case, as far as I know, this was told to me because I don't remember my father, but my father would come home in the fall and head for the woods, chop the year's supply of wood, haul it with an ox to the house, cut it stove lengths and split it and put it away for the year.
So, what kind of saw, what kind of equipment were they using?
Well, they'd probably use what you'd call a buck saw at that time. It was a wooden frame with a saw blade on it, and then after that it graduated to the pulp saws that were a little bit better.
How did that equipment work? Did it work well? Or
Well, at that time, when you didn't know better, it worked okay. But if you had seen a chainsaw at that time, you'd never want to go back to that. But they managed. That's all they had. That's all they knew.
Was it much work to get the wood?
It was all. Everything was hard work. Compared to today, everything was hard work. Nobody works today the way those old people worked. They got up early in the morning and they worked until dark, and there was no TV, no radio to listen to, nothing to do after dark till they went to bed.
What about hunting?
I never did any hunting. I was never interested in that, but people used to do some hunting. Used to catch deer for meat, and rabbits. Rabbits were very popular food in the winter time at that time.
What about berries?
There were some berries. West Ayrshire wasn't very famous for berries, but cranberries and foxberries usually were quite plentiful. But I never saw too many large fields of strawberries or anything like that around here.
So it wasn't something. Talked to people in other areas who said that they picked berries for their.
Well, in
They
the
had
little
money.
Raw and Cape Ogat area, they did that because berries were very plentiful there. I remember picking berries in Cape Ogat. We'd leave by boat. A group of people would get in the boat and sail to Cape Ogat in the morning and pick berries all day and then come back home at night. But right here in West Ayrshire, there are some, but not that many.
You mentioned that there was no electricity.
No electricity in my day, no.
So how did And you mentioned some of the differences that made in people's lives. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
All the appliances that you know today did not exist, and if they had, you wouldn't have been able to run them. So washing was done by hand. Some people had wooden washing machines that operated by hand with a lever. Not everybody did. Most people washed on washboards. They had to heat the water on the stove, all the water from the well, and heat it on the stove. There were very few people had pumps, and the ones who did, they were hand pumps. Like I remember when I got a little bigger and I was staying at the Glebe house, I used to pump the water, and that was into a big tank in the attic. And you'd pump the water by hand down in the basement, and that would go up into the attic into a big tank and come back by gravity for the bathroom and the kitchen sink. But we didn't have those facilities. It was just buckets. When the buckets were empty, you ran to the well for another bucket. That was our source of water. And refrigeration, there was none of that except for the more affluent people who probably had what they called ice chests. They were an insulated wooden cabinet that was lined with zinc and insulated, and they used to, some people stored ice for the summer. They had ice houses. The Digdons on the island had ice stored away for the summer, and they used to buy a block of ice and put it in there, and that would keep the food pretty cool until the block of ice melted, and then they had to get another one. There were no radios. There were gramophones in my time. We had a gramophone at home. It was with the regular discs that you see today, but it was operated by a spring. It wasn't electric. It was just like a spring that you wound. Yeah, you wound the crank, you wound the spring up, and that would turn the disc, and it would give you the music from the record. It wasn't stereo. It wasn't that good. And that was the only amusement that they had that I know of. Of course, a lot of people that were talented and they played fiddle and played guitar and things like that. And if they had dances, that's the way they had them. They had the local people playing the fiddle. That's what they used for music.
How did people react to the electricity when it first came in?
Very few people had electricity when it first came in. I think it came in around 39 when not too many people could afford to have the houses wired. Of course, it was a lot cheaper then than it is now. But not too many people had electricity installed when I was coming up there when it first came in. I remember the LeBlancs there, Rudolph LeBlanc's house and store that was installed. Sheriff Poirier, that's where the old conference used to be across from the Glebe house. They had it there, and the Glebe house, and perhaps a few more people in the area, but not too many. But then as the war broke out and things were more prosperous and a lot of people were going away to work and it made money, when then they got houses wired. And today I don't think you could find one that doesn't have electricity. Telephones, there were probably 2 telephones in the village that I know of, one at Rudolph LeBlanc, probably one at the sheriff's too, and one at the Glebe house.
3 telephones. So what did you do if you had to get a message out?
You had to get a message out, you walked to the nearest telephone, or if it was closer to get the message, you stopped at the house where you wanted to pass the message.
So if you had to call the doctor for something, you had to
call the doctor, you had to go to Rudolph LeBlanc's. They had at that time what they called the Central, and they were the Central for West Ayrshire, the Central telephone. So you could go there, and they expected that people would go there and make their calls there. But they called the doctor, and usually the doctor was in Ayrshire, Dr. B.A. LeBlanc or Dr. DeVoe. Those were the doctors at the time that I was growing up.
So when did people start to get telephone?
Uh, I would say that the real craze for telephones, and most people got them in, a lot of people got them in the 50s. And at that time there were very few lines. It was, when we got our first telephone, it was Maritime Telephone, but it had been taken over from Almadam Mutual Telephone. It was a bunch of shareholders who had gotten together and had put up a telephone service throughout the island, and a man by the name of Babineau from Erishad used to maintain it. He used to go by with a horse and cart or a horse and wagon, and he'd fix the wires and fix the poles and so forth. And the telephones, there were very few lines. There were just a few lines, but they were multi-people, multi-customer lines, you know, like the line that we were in. I remember that the first one we were in was line 4 here in West Ayrshire, and our number was 4 ring 25, so there must have been at least 25 on the line.
It really caught on in the 50s.
In the 50s, a lot of people started putting them in, but then it was still the old telephone system, the old switchboard in Ayrshire. The Cutlers were running the switchboard in Ayrshire, but then when Maritime decided to renovate the whole system, they put in these stations, in like the one that's in the Grandick Road there, and they put in the dial phones. So when the dial phones came in, then everybody got a phone.
And the other phones before were...
Yeah, it was a crank, and you rang so many turns of the crank. In the case where it was, let's say, 4 ring 12, you'd ring 1 long and 2 short. And anybody on that line heard that ring. If there were 10 people of that line, 10 people heard the ring, but they recognized the ring. If they wanted to listen in, they could. There was nothing to stop them.
So you had no privacy?
No privacy, no. Very few people had a private line. The Glebe House had probably a private line. Suppose it.
What about the roads?
The roads were not very good for a long time. In 1955, I guess, they decided to build a new road from Grand Anse through the Scouse onto Ayrshire. And then the one through West Ayrshire by the shortcut came after that. I don't remember exactly what time. But they reconstructed the road there and made it more substantial. And then later on they paved it. I suppose perhaps around 55, 57 they paved the road all around the island. But before that it was very messy and muddy and ruts and potholes and very narrow. People got by, but they were used to that.
So, people were driving cars though?
Oh yes, there were cars.
Were there many cars?
There were very few when I was coming up. When I was a kid there before the war, there were probably 3 or 4 cars at the most. There was one at the LeBlancs, there was one at the Glebe House. The Georges on the Clint George, that would be Clancy George's father, Widow George's father. They had a car for a long time, as far back as I can remember. But they were about the only ones around here that I remember had cars. But then again, as the war broke out and people got more jobs, people started getting cars.
So if you wanted to go somewhere, did you walk or did you take the horse?
Well, it depends where you were going. If you were going to Ayrshire, most of the times you walked. A lot of people had horses, and some pretty nice horses. Some of them had nice horses, and they all had wagons or riding sleighs in the winter time, and they'd go back and forth with that, and it would work pretty well. The mail used to come in by horse and sleigh or horse and wagon in the summertime. In the summertime, usually he had a truck, but in the winter time the roads weren't plowed, so it became the horse and sleigh, and that's how the mail came in from Grandance here. The train used to come to Grandance at that time.
So how often would you go to Ayrshire?
Oh, it depended, but maybe at the most 5-6 times a year, depending on what family was, and what needs they had to go to Ayrshire.
What kinds of things would you go to Ayrshire for?
We'd go to Ayrshire for perhaps special orders, the larger stores like what's Hugh Leblanc now, that was Hugh Leblanc's father, G.J. Leblanc at that time. They had a store there. The Lebruns had a store. And these were general stores. You could buy pretty well anything you wanted there. Building materials, groceries, clothing at Lebrun's. Mostly anything you wanted.
So it would only be if you needed.
Yeah, something special, because there were 2 stores here in West Ayrshire. There was a store at Leblanc's there, right just on this side of the Knights of Columbus Hall, and there was another one right on the other side of the Knights of Columbus Hall where Willie Dory lives now. There was a store there. That was Sheriff Query's store. And they were both general stores there. You could buy pretty well anything you wanted there. Boats came from Halifax to the wharf here, and that's how they got their supplies. Called that the Halifax boat.
So what kinds of things would you have had to buy in the stores that you were mostly self-sufficient with?
Well, you'd have to buy like sugar, tea, flour, fruit, if any. You didn't have oranges on the table every day. Yeah, I remember that my mother used to buy a barrel of apple in the falls. When the falls come in there, the apples were probably cheap, and she'd buy a barrel of apples. That lasted for a while until it was all gone. That was it.
You mentioned a little bit about what the roads were like in the winter. Were people driving cars at all in the winter?
If it was a winter that there was very little snow, that they could keep on going, cars had chains at that time, and they could get by with quite a little bit of snow. But normally they didn't. Normally they'd put the cars up in the fall, and they'd use horse and sleigh or walked.
Was there a snowplow?
There was the first snowplow. I remember when the first snowplow came in. It was W.N. MacDonald from Sydney used to have the subsidy to run a boat from Mulgrave to Canso to Ayrshire, and in the winter they ran a bus service from Ayrshire to West Ayrshire and perhaps to the rest of the island, and they had a truck with a plough on it, but then that didn't last too long. And afterwards the Department of Highways had one of these little Caterpillar tractors, a 20 horsepower Caterpillar tractor with a plough on it, that they used to try and keep the roads open with, but it was so much more difficult at that time because the roads were narrow and everybody had fences all along the road, and of course it held the snow right in. There was a lot more snow on the roads then than there is now, because it couldn't blow away. It was just about trapped between the fences, so you had a lot more snow. Not necessarily that there fell more snow, but there stayed more snow, especially on the road.
When you were growing up in West Ayrshire, what kinds of things were you guys doing for entertainment as children? What kinds of games were you playing?
You played ball and
Baseball?
well, whatever. Baseball, I guess. Yeah, you had a bat. In the majority of cases, it was a bat that somebody had hewn out of a piece of wood. But you had a ball and a bat, and you played with that. Nobody played hockey as such, but you skated. There were ponds, and you skated on the ponds.
When did hockey come in?
I don't know, I was never much of a sportsman, but hockey play real hockey games, I guess only came in perhaps in the last 20 years or so. Before that it was just little spots here and there that they had, nothing too official, and I don't think they traveled any distance. The arena, after they built the arena, it made a big difference as far as sports were concerned. But that's what, 25, 30 years ago at the most, not 30 I don't suppose. Maybe 25. And we used to play in the springs, we used to play what they called piggy, or ricky. It was a little stick pointed at both ends, about 4 inches long, and it was pointed at both ends, and you'd hit that with another stick and it would fly up. It would twirl up in the air, and you'd try to bat it from there with the other stick. And whatever distance you could shoot it, you gave so many paces to the opponents to reach that little stick in so many paces, and if he couldn't do it in so many paces, you were still in. If he could reach it in so many paces, you were out. That was about the nature of the game.
You mentioned some of the chores that you had to do growing up. What other types of things you were carrying water?
You carried water where there was where there were no hand pumps. You carried water in buckets. You took in wood and kindlings for the night. Milked the cow, fed the animals, chickens. That's about it.
Was there much free time?
Yeah, there was quite a bit of free time, if you could call it free time, I guess, yes, I guess so. As a kid, you had quite a bit of time that you could play. As an adult, there was always something to do.
What going to school now? Where was the school at?
School was the Knights of Columbus Hall. That was at one time a convent. When the West Ayrshire village first became a parish, the convent was up, and there were sisters in the convent, teaching sisters. Then there were teaching brothers who came in, French teaching brothers who came in and occupied the house where Anna LeBlanc is now. It's for sale now. But that was the place where the teaching brothers from France were teaching the boys, and the girls were at the Knights of Columbus Hall. That was the old convent. Then after the sisters went away and the brothers went away, the house was sold at LeBlanc's, and it was bought by Mouchet's, originally from France, I guess, and they built a store there, and they were the major merchants of the area. Then the convent became a school, a public school. It was owned by the Episcopal Corporation, by the diocese, but it was rented to the parish as a school. I don't think they were paying any rent on it, they were just maintaining it physically. And that's where I went to school all my life, except for the last year I went to the convent in Ayrshire. The old convent is burned down now. It was for grade 11, they didn't teach grade 11 here.
What was the building like on the inside? How many classrooms were there?
There were 3 classrooms when I was going to school. There were 2 downstairs and 1 upstairs. And there was, after the upstairs was unfinished, we used to play there during recess or in bad weather. We couldn't go outside. It was very rough. It was finished in wood boards, painted. There were posts here and there in the middle of the classroom to hold the ceiling up. And there was a pot-belly stove in the middle of the classroom, and that's what heated the building. There was no running water. There was no electricity. Not when I was going. They installed that after I left. My last year in school here was 1944.
So there wasn't much in the way of facilities.
Our facilities were just about nil. And it was multi-grade besides. They taught up to grade 10. In 3 classrooms, you didn't have a classroom per grade.
So who was teaching? Was it the sisters teaching, or was it?
And in the later years, the sisters were teaching, but not during the time when I was going to school. There were no sisters here. It was mostly lay teachers, and in a lot of cases, it was local people who had qualified, gone to normal college, and became teachers. Some of them were permissive teachers that had perhaps grade 10, didn't go to normal school, but had a permissive license to teach, because, you know, good qualified teachers were probably hard to come by.
What kind of people were they strict?
Yes, they were strict, but you didn't consider them strict because at that time you didn't try any stunts, you know, and the odd one had to be reprimanded, I suppose, but it wasn't discipline was never a problem that I can remember. But the teacher had a lot of authority, and it was well respected.
How do you mean the teacher had a lot of authority?
Well, you know, that if the teacher told you to do a certain thing, you did it. You didn't ask any questions. You didn't say, well, you know, she doesn't have the authority to tell me to do that, or, you know, I'm going to go home and tell my mother is going to talk to her, or something like that. There wasn't such a thing.
What happened if you went home and told her?
You probably got reprimanded over again. But you didn't brag about being reprimanded in school. Usually you tried to keep that hidden.
So it was a disgrace, huh?
It was more or less a disgrace, yeah.
Do you feel you got a good education out of the system?
For what was available at the time, I think so. You know, if I don't, what I didn't get in the line of education wasn't the system's fault. It was because I didn't go for it. Because a lot of people my age have qualified very highly, became college professors, priests, teachers. You know, they were. The system was there if you wanted to go for it, but it was a lot harder than it is today.
So you went to convent in Ayrshire.
For 1 year, for grade 11.
Were you boarding there at the convent? Or?
No, I was driving a bicycle back and forth, and then in the winter time, we used to walk. But sometimes, if it got too bad, you stayed over.
What was that like?
It was all sisters there at the convent at that time, 1944, and they were pretty strict. They didn't fool around too much. But I think they offered a fairly good education. They had a pretty good system, and it was provincial exams at that time, so you either had to have it or you didn't make it, because there was no mercy offered you there.
What kind of subjects were you studying there?
In my time there was English, French, math, economics, social studies. History in grade 11 was one of your high subjects. History, English, and math were the 3 main subjects.
Was there Latin?
There was Latin in my first years of high school, but not in the last years. The first years of high school, 9 and 10, I suppose, I probably had Latin. They called it elementary Latin at that time. I didn't pursue it too far, but I had a couple of years of elementary Latin, not too much. I was staying at Father Brion's at the time, in the winter time, doing the chores there. Of course, he emphasized the Latin bit.
What about the convent itself? What kind of a building was it?
In Ayrshire, big long building. It was between the existing glebe house and the vestry in that area. They had girls boarding there, girl boarders. They didn't board the boys, but the boys went to school there. Then besides that school for the more elementary grades, they had the academy, and that was right the parking lot of the municipal office, the new municipal office below the school. The old academy was right there. There were 4 classrooms in that.
You mentioned that there was a convent in West Ayrshire,
Yes,
and then those sisters left, and that became a public school, right?
that's right. And then when they built a new school in West Ayrshire, I don't know if you remember that, it burnt in 1986, I guess, in January of '86. Then it was sold to the Knights of Columbus to make a hall.
And where were the sisters? Were sisters always in West Ayrshire, or did they leave and come back?
No, they left and came back. It wasn't the same congregation of sisters. I think it was the Sisters of Charity in the old convent. That would have been way back, my mother's time. She went to school to the sisters there. But in my time it was all day teachers. And then in 54 maybe, there were, and the Filles who came and they occupied the building that was right across from the glebe house now. That was the convent. That was old Sheriff Poirier's house. And you must remember that it was torn down not too many years ago.
And that was their convent building.
That was their convent building. That's where they stayed, but they taught in the school back at the glebe house there, where in the new school that burnt down.
Maybe change it a little bit. You mentioned some of the people who were better off and
Oh
had
yes.
money in West Ayrshire. You mentioned the Poiriers and the LeBlancs. Was there anybody else who had
Well, most of the ones who operated vessels were a bit more affluent than the regular. They had, there were, the Forgerons had vessels, the Lavanges had vessels. Father Girouard's father, they had vessels. And way back, like my wife's grandparents, they were great sailors and they had vessels. And they actually built a large four-master right below the existing house there. That's my in-law's house on top of the hill. Right below in the hollow there was a four-master built there.
who were your in-laws?
Gilbert Girouard and Lena Girouard. She was a Lavange. She would be the Lavange sister.
He built a large four-masted school.
Well, no, not them, not the Girouards, the Pongs. That would be his mother's parents built it there.
Oh, okay. So there was that kind of vessel construction going on all around West Ayrshire?
Yes, there was. There were a lot of vessels. Even when I was a kid, maybe 14, 15, there were something like 7 vessels here in the harbour.
Run by local people?
You're all run by local people.
Was there many people occupied in sailing on those vessels?
No, the crews were very small on those vessels. Perhaps the captain and 2 others at the most. In the summer, they usually hauled coal from Sydney to Canso to around here. If we bought coal, we bought it at the wharf from the vessels. They'd come and unload a load of coal. They'd go to Ayrshire with coal. Everybody, like the churches and the halls and stuff like that, they'd buy coal from the vessels. And in the fall, they'd make one trip to the island and come back with vegetables and produce for the winter. Potatoes, stuff like that.
So there were no vessels being built though when you were?
Not in my time, no, but there were vessels being worked on in my time. In the winter, the harbor used to freeze, and that would act as a stage, and anything above watermark they'd do in the winter on the vessels, because they had like a beautiful platform to work from. The ice was all there.
So those were the people who were better off.
Well, they were better off. They were, I think they were probably, they made themselves pretty good jobs, you know, and if they were lucky in the summer and they got good freights, well, they'd make a few dollars. It would be nothing compared to today's standards of wages, but at that time it meant a lot.
And what was the relationship between the people who had no money and the people who had a lot of money?
Very good. I don't think it was regarded.
Were there any Protestant people in West Ayrshire?
Just two families in my time when I was a kid. The Digdons on Cretan Island were Protestants, and the Dorts. That's right on the other side of the co-op there. The house is right close to the road. That long house on the left-hand side going towards Ayrshire. It's right close to the road. That was the Dorts. They were Protestants. They came from Half Island Cove across the bay.
Was there any tension between them?
No. I went to school with the Dort girls, and Stanley Digdon was probably one of my best friends. No. There was no mention. The Dorts were, the parents were English, didn't understand French, but the children in school, the kids I went to school with, they spoke French the same as us. We never thought of speaking English.
Was everybody speaking French in West Ayrshire?
At that time, everybody did, yes. And now, a lot of people have drifted off to English. They speak English in the house. But we always spoke French in the house here.
When did people start to speak English?
As they started going away, I suppose, and they'd come back and spoke English, they were probably more exposed to the English language. And in the way back, before my time, a lot of people went to Gloucester to fish. And if your name was French, you didn't have as good a chance to get jobs and to get on good vessels as you did if you were English, maybe. And it was easier for those people if they had to write it down to write it down in English. And a lot of people like the Leblancs and the Legends, and they went to Youngs and they went to Whites and stuff like that. But here, the ones who remained here retained their French version of the names.
So when did it start to die out?
The English, maybe after the war. People mixed a lot more. People went out a lot more after the war. You know, there were jobs involved here and there, and people went. A lot of people after the war, a lot of people went to Ontario. They worked at Massey Harris, where they were making farm implements. A lot of people went to work there, and a lot of people went to work on lake boats, stuff like that up in Ontario.
So there wasn't many people speaking English in West Ayrshire.
Yeah, right in West Ayrshire, no. Most of the people spoke French. And of course they spoke the French we still speak. The Anglicized version, the Acadian French.
So there wasn't much of a tension between French and English because there was no English.
Well, there were no English to speak of, but it didn't. To my knowledge, there was never a friction between French and English. And in Ayrshire, there were a lot more English families in Ayrshire, and I never heard, you know, that there were clashes because of the language wasn't a barrier.
What about in terms of politics?
Politics, well, it was at that time like it is now, you know, was mostly the conservatives and the liberals, and some believed in the conservatives and others believed in the liberals, and, you know, it was in some cases around election time there were some little brawls, but nothing to speak of. Nothing that didn't iron out a few weeks after the election.
Is there anything memorable about elections that stands out in your mind?
Not particularly, no. It was fairly quiet as far as I know. There, the usual hullabaloo during the campaign, but then everything died off very fast after the election. But in older times there, I think before my time, there used to be these parties that did put on after the election, and I think some people used to brawl at that, but there was probably booze flying around, and that would create, it wouldn't take much to start a fight. But in my time, I don't remember too many people getting involved in too many fights.
Was that in general, or wasn't many people felt like if you went to a dance, was it common to see people fighting?
Yeah, well, I don't know if you'd say it was common, but you could encounter a fight at a dance, I would expect. You know, I was never much of a dancer, and I never attended too many dances. I couldn't see too much value in it, but I've often heard of fights at dances.
What types of things were people doing to entertain themselves, older people?
They had parties in the winter time, in the house parties, and people would play different music, you know, and they'd gather in certain houses. And in Lent, just before Lent, they had what they called the Mikaram, and most young people did that, and a few houses let them in, and of course where they let them in there were quite a bit of activities. They'd dance and they'd fool around, but nothing too bad. I never heard of too many people getting drunk and getting rowdy or anything like that. The odd few, but they couldn't afford getting drunk. They wouldn't be able to buy the liquor unless they made it.
So there wasn't much drinking at all?
Not that much, no.
But less than now?
I would say in general, yes, much less than now. I don't think it wasn't accessible. They didn't have the money to buy it.
Were there any organizations or clubs or so on that operated in the community in West
Oh
Ireland?
yes, they had a few clubs that went on. Perhaps a little bit before my time there, they had ACJC. I don't know exactly what it represented, but they used to call it La CGC. And they had a hall where Mury-July's house is now, on top of the hill here. And they used to go in there and do some boxing and wrestling, and I suppose they had dances. And they used to hold concerts in there.
Is it a big building?
It was a fair-sized building. It was bought by the Port Royal School District in about 43 or 44, and it was cut in two and hauled on the ice to Port Royal, and that's what the Port Royal School is now. Now the Port Royal School is now owned by some dweller, I believe, but we used to use it in my time when I was working for school board. We used to use it for a maintenance building to store our supplies and stuff like that. It was right above where there was a store in Port Royal there. Still there. The building is still there.
And that was a hall, and was that a sports club or a youth club?
It was like a youth club, you know, mostly boys. And then later, maybe around 1939 or so, or 38 or 39, they built what is now the West Irishat Co-op. That was a hall. They built that as a hall.
The parish?
Yes. And it was used as a hall for, you know, they used to have dances there and bingos and stuff like that. And the co-op was in an old house right above that, where the co-op parking lot is there, further up above where the co-op is now. And then the co-op bought the hall for a store, and they tore down the old co-op building. The old co-op building was the old Dougal Boyle property. Dougal Boyle was there maybe in the late 18s, and he operated a farm there. He was also a fisherman, and he was also a school teacher. Came from the Nabu area.
So the co-op, how long has the co-op been operating in West Ayrshire?
The co-op must have been operating in West Ayrshire since 37, or 36 or 37.
Who founded it?
At that time, Father Brion was was instrumental in founding the co-op and starting the co-op movement here. But that was originated in Antigonish with the Cody Institute there.
And who was the driving force behind this youth club?
I guess just the local boys, and I suppose it was supervised by the parish priest. Supervised it mostly. Probably lent some ideas.
How big was that co-op when it was started? Was it, how many, well, I mean, how many families would have been involved in it?
There are about 300 families in West Ayrshire, but at that time I don't think there were as many, and when I say 300 families, I include Martinique, Gentry's Island, Port Royal and West Ayrshire. I think there was a branch of this co-op in a private home in Port Royal. It would have been Jean T. Rogers' father was running that. And here it was Freddie Boudreau was running the co-op here, but here they had a building of their own. And I think Gendrons used to come and shop here or in Port Royal, but I don't remember that there was a particular place in Gendrons Harbour where they operated the store. So there would have probably been regular customers, 25, 30 families, because the other two stores were still operating.
And they would have had a good share of the business?
Well, they would have had a good share of the business because, you know, they had been there a long time. They were established a long time, long before the co-op. Quite a few people, quite a few families joined the co-op. And then there was a credit union that was operating here in West Ayrshire at that time. And it was moved over to Petit de Gras. They just took the whole thing over.
So the credit union that's in Petit de Gras now was started in West Ayrshire?
Not necessarily started, not necessarily, I shouldn't say that the credit union was started in West Ayrshire, but the credit union that was started in West Ayrshire was amalgamated to the one in Petit de Gras. So probably the one in Petit de Gras was started at the same time as the one in West Ayrshire, but they amalgamated the two.
And when did that happen?
Oh, I wouldn't be able to venture too many guesses as to what year it took place, but I was living here, in this house, maybe 30 years ago.
Were people satisfied with that when they had to?
Well, I imagine that you know they were only operating a very small building in next to the co-op there, just a small little place. And I don't know how many members there were, but whatever members were there, they just moved them over to Petit de Gras and they discontinued the building.
They talked a little bit about religion. Was religion, when you were growing up, different than it is now?
Yes, I think it was much more respected. I think a lot more people went to church, and it was people had, I think people in general had probably more faith than they had today. You know, there were more members attending the Sunday masses than there are today. There, of course, at that time there was only one mass on Sunday. There were no masses on Saturday. So of course it would mean a lot more people. It was a fair-sized church for the size of the parish here. It used to keep pretty full. We used to, as kids, we had to go to catechism, make our first communion, confirmation.
Was there catechism in the school, or was that separate?
There was some catechism in the school, but in the summertime the parish priest would teach catechism to the kids. And in the spring he'd take the first communion crowd and he'd have them in the spring and taught them catechism until they were ready for first communion. The same thing happened for confirmation, but that only came about every 3 or 4 years. The bishop would come down and do confirmation.
What about in the house?
In the house, catechism was pretty regular. It was coming up, my mother talking catechism from the time I was probably about 6 years old and until I was confirmed anyway.
What did she have a book?
Yeah. We had what they called the little catechism. The petit catéchisme. It was, everybody had one of those and you had to know that in order to be able to make your first communion or to be confirmed. There were like 2 different stages.
What about prayer in the house?
Prayer in the house was a daily thing. Everybody said prayers before going to bed, or after supper usually the rosary was said, especially during Lent.
What about fasting?
Fasting at that time, that was mandatory. Friday was a fast day. Nobody ate meat on Friday. It was fish, period. And then there were the different feast days in the year, like the day before Christmas, New Year, Christmas Eve would be a fast day, and during Lent, Wednesdays were fast days, and you ate fish only, no meat during the fast days.
And what about, did you go to communion every week?
Not necessarily every week, but you did every month. It was more or less the first Friday of the month, everybody went to confession and went to communion. You left from school, you stopped at church. You had on the Friday afternoon, the priest would be hearing confessions, and Saturday morning you'd go to communion. That was
Saturday morning mass?
Yeah, that was the first Friday and the first Saturday of each month. But then during the week people went to communion too, and they went to mass, but as kids you didn't miss the first Friday unless you were sick.
So during the week on Sunday you wouldn't go to communion?
Not usually at that time, no. The odd few did, but it wasn't a tradition at that time for people to go to communion on Sunday.
Now, what about, I've heard that in West Ayrshire they used to auction the pews
Yes.
in the church.
I did that myself, the last of it. I was probably the last one to do it.
You
That
conducted
was
the
a-
auction?
That was a means of revenue for the parish. It wasn't a compulsory thing. You didn't have to buy a pew. You didn't have to bid that high on it if you didn't want to. But if you wanted a particular pew and somebody bid you up, you had to pay for it. And they start maybe at around $5 or in that area. And sometimes if somebody were really hard-headed and they really wanted a particular pew and the 2 parties were equally anxious to get that particular pew, it would run it up maybe to $25. But it was a good means of revenue for the parish, and it's only happened once a year.
Did it ever cause any conflict?
Oh, well, there were probably some slight conflicts, but nothing to speak of. Well, some people argued over it outside. I never saw a conflict in the church.
Did people respect the priests as much as
Very much so.
So, if I was a priest, would I, and I told somebody they should be doing something or they shouldn't be doing that one?
It depends who it was, but generally, I'd say that you'd be respected.
One thing we usually like to ask about is folklore. And we've heard that the old people were good at predicting weather.
It was their only means. There was nothing else to predict the weather for them. They used the moon mostly.
What would they
You
look
know,
for?
they went by what the moon would. If it was fine, when the new moon would come in, there was a good chance that that week would be fine. If it was windy or wet, there was a good chance that the whole week would be. And I guess they had different ways of predicting the weather, especially those old mariners that spent most of their lives on the sea with those old vessels. But the moon was a pretty good way of predicting the weather. Plus they'd see signs in the sky, like the sun or the rainbows or things like that. They go by that. I was never one to know too much about predicting weather.
And what about home remedies?
Oh yeah, there were home remedies. When I was coming up, they used to, every spring they used to make up some kind of a concoction of sulfur and molasses. They'd stir that up and you had to take a spoonful of that every day, 9 days or something like that.
What was that for?
That was to, more or less like as a tonic, brace you up for the spring. In the spring, when people generally got flus and stuff like that.
What if you did get a flu?
Or if you did get the flu, you doctored yourself up the best way you could. Very seldom you had to go to the doctor. It was, pretty serious case if you had to go to the doctor. And you could buy remedies in the stores. Most general stores carried shelf remedies, tonics and stuff like that, cough medicines, cod liver oil.
Were there Indians who came to West Ayrshire?
Yes, Indians used to come and sell baskets now and then. They'd come with like a sheet, a bunch of baskets in the sheet, and the sheet was tied up. They'd carry that, go from house to house selling baskets. I remember that one.
What about gypsies?
Apparently they were here, but not in my time. I don't remember ever seeing gypsies, but I've heard a lot of the older people talking about them. They used to come and camp on the island there.
In Creighton.
Yeah. But I don't think they were very welcome visitors. I think people used to drive them off. They could, but I can't say that I ever saw them, but I heard of them.
Were there any people here in West Ayrshire practicing particular trades like blacksmiths? Or
Yes.
Was
Jim
blacksmith?
McDonald was the local blacksmith here in West Ayrshire. Very good blacksmith. His father before him was a blacksmith. The forge was where the post office is now.
And what types of things was he doing? Shoeing horses and stuff?
Shoeing horses, any kind of hardware that would go on sleighs, on carts, cart wheels, putting new tires on cart wheels and wagon wheels and stuff like that.
Was he doing iron work for vessels?
He did iron work for vessels if he needed to. Yeah. He was apparently a very good blacksmith. I remember him well. Used stop there, watch him work back and forth on my way back and forth to school. But you didn't go inside, you just watched from the door. You didn't go and get yourself in his way. And there were the local carpenters. Leo Dugan was a local carpenter, Tom Woodrow was a local carpenter. They did carpentry work for the people.
What in general were people in West Ayrshire doing to make a living?
Most fished and did a bit of farming. Some people went away to work.
And what did you do?
After I left school, I did carpentry work for about a year or so, and then I taught school on a permissive license for 1 year here in West Ayrshire and for 2 years in Robins. That's just on the other side of Ayrshire on the way to Cape Oglet. Top of the hill there was a school there. It's now Digdon's Freight Shed. And I taught school there. The name of the section was Orange School Section. Won't ask me where it got the name of Orange, but it was Orange School Section. I taught school there for 2 years. Then I went to work with the Canadian Hydrographic Service. They were drawing charts of the water around here. I worked with them for a few years. Then I went to as an assessor for Richmond County, and from assessor for Richmond County I probably worked for a year or so at J.E. Benoit Limited. He had the farm then and the dairy and the Imperial Oil and propane gas, and I worked there for a year or so, a year and a half maybe, and then I went to work as supervisor of school maintenance for the county, and I stayed there until I retired. I was there 25 years.
I think that's about it, unless you have something else that you can think of.
I don't. Not that I'm thinking of right now, probably after you're gone.
Maybe tell us about your wife.
Since my wife was a jailor, she was one of 2 girls in the family. There were only 2 girls in the family. The other one's in Sydney. She became a school teacher, and she taught school in Lardways the first year. Then she taught school in West Ayrshire for most of the rest of her teaching career. She taught school for 34 years in all. She was 2 years in Ayrshire after the school closed there. So, except for 3 years, she taught the 31 years here in West Ayrshire, between the old school and the new. She's also the organist in the church. She takes care of the choir. And she retired about the same time I retired. And she's very busy. She's occupied with a lot of different things. She does a little bit, she teaches a little music. And she's busy with a lot of different activities, CWL and so forth. We were married 37 years this August. I built this house and most of the furniture that's in it. And I retired 9 years ago, and I kept myself busy. As my health permitted, I kept myself busy at cabinet work and a bit of machining. I have a complete workshop in the basement. That's about my history. Okay. These are my wife's grandparents and one of her uncles. They were Ben and Eliza Levange and Benny Levange. The young fellow's name was Benny. He was drowned in Canso, fell off in the boat. That's the interior of the original West Ayrshire church as I knew it when I was a kid. It burnt in 1976. It was built in 1876. Just 100 years old when it burnt down. It's replaced by the existing church.